Hey, how's it going? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Gabby and today we're going to be doing my August wrap up. In the month of August, I read a total of 16 books, but I had so many DNFs this month. It was actually outrageous. I don't think I've ever had so many DNFs within 1 month. I really think that by the end of the month, I just burnt myself out completely on reading and I fell into kind of the biggest reading slump that I've had this year because look at this stack of DNFs. I mean, these are 7 of the books that I DNF'd this month, but there was even more than just this. Because on top of these, I also DNF'd the new Sherry Lupina, the one What Have You Done? I also ended up DNFing Youth Juice. When I tried to listen to it on audio, there were so many books. There's probably even more that I can't even think of right now, but these are just a few of the DNFs from this month. I did talk about most of these DNFs in the reading vlog that I worked on this month where a random number generator determined how many hours that I read every single day. Most of these DNFs did come from that video, so I'm not going to explain again why I ended up DNFing all of these, but if you're curious, all of the reasons for why I DNF'd these books are in the vlogs that I worked on this month. Another reading vlog that I worked on in the month of August was the reading vlog where I read some new thriller and horror books, so if you missed that, I'll have that link down below. And then this month I also worked on the next round of reading Reese Witherspoon's book club recommendations, and it was episode 2, so I read the next 4 picks from May, June, July, and August. Also, over on my Patreon this month, I did make an exclusive video dedicated to It Ends With Us by Colleen Hoover. I did a reread of the book and then I watched the movie adaptation in the same video, and I kind of got to do a comparison of the book versus the movie and how I feel about both. So if you missed that vlog and you're interested, I will have that linked down below as well. Yeah, let's go ahead and jump into the 16 things that I did read this month. And I think once again, I'm going to be going in order from my lowest rated to my highest rated. Starting off with the one thing that I actually didn't even rate this month. It's a manga that I read. This one's called Until I Meet My Husband, and this one is a manga that I decided not to rate because this one is actually a memoir. It's a nonfiction. It says that this one is a memoir of a gay activist and the first religiously recognized same-sex marriage in Japan. And so I thought this was a really interesting read because it's a memoir and because it's a true story about the first same-sex marriage. I thought it was very informative and very interesting. The thing that was tough about this one for me is that it was so much heavier than I was expecting, especially with the religious kind of themes in this book and talking about the shame that he feels about being gay because of his religious beliefs and stuff like that. It was very heavy to read. And then the only other manga that I read this month ended up being rated pretty low, and it's Smashed by Junji Ito. I would consider myself to be a pretty big Junji Ito fan, and this one is another short story collection of about 13 different short stories, and I always talk about the fact that I love how Junji Ito writes the short stories. I feel like it's something that he does very well, but this book, oh my gosh, there's just something about this one in particular that really just didn't work for me. I didn't find the stories to be that interesting or that scary. I mean, there were 2 in here that I really loved, and that was Bloodsucking Darkness, the first one that had to deal with the bats. I thought that one was so good. And then I also really loved the one that was called The Mystery of the Haunted House. I thought that one was great. But the rest of them, I just thought they were so boring and just not that interesting. I thought some of them, definitely had potential, but then by the ending, I feel like some of them dropped the ball too. So this was just not what I was hoping it would be, and I ended up giving this one 2 stars. Another book that I gave 2 stars this month, which is very unfortunate, is my BookTube book club pick, I Was a Teenage Slasher by Stephen Graham Jones. We just had the live show for this, so if you missed it, I will have it linked down below where we talked about all of our thoughts. But unfortunately, this one just ended up really not being my thing. This one is a horror book. We're following this young teenage boy named Tolly, and he's growing up in Texas in the 1980s. And then this story's kind of told as reflecting back on his teenagehood. So he's writing the story 17 years in the future after the events have happened, and he's kind of reflecting back on what happened. Man, there was something about this writing style that it just did not work for me personally. I was not only finding it hard to get invested in the story, I was always feeling a little bit confused about what was actually happening and what was real. But then I also feel like there was a lot of repetition in the writing that just started to irk me a little bit while I was reading it. I don't know why, I feel like I never really connected with Tolly as a character in this book, but then the ending of this book definitely saved it for me, and I actually really liked the ending of this. So ratings wise, I do have to give this one around a 2 star, even though it's heartbreaking because I really wanted to enjoy this one. But you should watch our live show if you're still interested in reading the book because, Kayla on the live show, she gave this 5 stars, so there's definitely an audience for this book. It's just not me, unfortunately. And then other 2-star reads that I had this month both came from the Reese Witherspoon book club video, which is super unfortunate. So we have How to End a Love Story, which this one is a romance that I was really looking forward to because it sounded so interesting. We're following these 2 characters who are both writers. I love that this one takes place in Los Angeles and that we're following this, woman who's a writer, and her books are getting a TV adaptation adaptation. And then of course there's this guy Grant that ends up getting hired to work on this specific adaptation, and she's like, oh my god, like that's like the one guy that I don't want to be working with because they have some kind of shared history. And so for me, jumping into this book, I had no idea what that shared history between them was going to be. And you know, to be fair, it doesn't talk about this in the premise at all, but there's something that happens within the first like 20% of this book where it gets revealed to you as the reader like how they know each other from the past, and I was so uncomfortable with the situation. It is just so bizarre to me that you would choose to have that be the reason how they know each other from the past. Like that is something that I don't know if I can get past personally, to root for their romance, because that just seems very odd. There was such a disconnect with me in this book because I feel like sometimes the tone of this book was so serious, you know, because they would be talking about like suicide, they would be talking about anxiety attacks, like there would be a lot of talk about depression and like these really heavy topics and very heavy themes. But then like in the next breath, it kind of would read like this like sexy romance where it was like very erotic and very over the top, and like the tone just kept shifting like all over the place, and I never really knew how I felt about what was happening in these characters. I just really did not connect with this one in the way that I was hoping for, and it ended up being 2 stars. And then the thriller from Reese Witherspoon's book club pick, The Unwedding. This is a book that I was really looking forward to because, you know, I do love a good thriller. I love thrillers that revolve around weddings. I think that that's very fun. And the thing that hurts the most with me giving this one 2 stars is because the beginning of this book, it had so much potential. It really hooked me at the start. We're following this woman, Ellery, who has recently just gotten divorced from her husband, and they were together for like 20 years. They were supposed to be going and celebrating their 20th anniversary at this place, but because they just recently divorced, she like doesn't want him to bring his new girlfriend or whatever to this place, so she just decides to go by herself. And then when she's at this place in Big Sur, California, she realizes that there's like a huge wedding happening at this resort, and she meets these other people who are also strangers who are like not a part of the wedding. But then of course somebody in the wedding party gets murdered, and then you're trying to figure out throughout the book like what actually happened. I feel like the beginning of this book was really interesting and it definitely hooked me right away with the story, but then very quickly I started to realize like, why is the story being told from this woman's point of view? Like she has no connection or relation to anything that's going on that's actually interesting in this book. And then I feel like this book also went off on like so many side tangents and like side plots of things that just did not feel relevant to what was going on in the story. I thought the ending ended up being very like, I don't know, predictable and underwhelming, and I just was not a big fan of this one, and it hurts because it had so much potential at the start of it, but this was 2 stars for me. Another book that I read this month was Not So Perfect Strangers, and this one is a thriller. This is one that I really ended up enjoying and having a fun time with because this is this author's spin on Strangers on a Train, which is one of my favorite tropes when it comes to thrillers. I'm not gonna lie, I do love the setup. We're gonna have 2 strangers who meet each other and then they decide to commit murder for each other. And so in this story, we're following this character named Tasha, who's this black woman, and then we also follow this woman named Maddie, who's a white woman. But what both of these women have in common is the fact that they're both in abusive relationships with their husbands. And so one day, Maddie is like running away from her abusive husband in the street, and she just gets into the car of this woman, Tasha, who she doesn't know, but Tasha decides to help her because she knows what it's like to be in that situation with her own husband, and so they decide to kind of help each other. Then this story ends up being kind of like a social thriller, you know, talking about the differences between what it's like to live in America when you're white versus when you're black, and like the different privileges that come with being white. I really connected with Tasha's character a lot in this book, and I thought this book was really well written, by the way. Like I think it was very fast paced. It's one of those books that you can easily read in like 1 or 2 sittings, which I really enjoyed. I thought Maddie's character was so like frustrating to read at times, but she was also fascinating because she's one of those characters that like you don't know if you can trust her perspective, and I really did like that about this. So I ended up giving this one 3.5 stars. I was really impressed with this and I really enjoyed the writing in this, so I do think that I'll be checking out more books from this author in the future. Another thriller that I ended up giving about 3.5 stars is Nanny Needed by Georgina Cross. And in this story, we're following this woman, Sarah, who she actually works in like the restaurant industry, but she sees this job opportunity to be this nanny for like a really rich family, and she just decides to take on the job because she needs the extra money. And of course the job just like sounds like it's too good to be true because the family's like super rich and like they're super nice, and then it starts to turn out that maybe it is too good to be true and that there's some weird, sinister, kind of freaky shit happening with this family. I really loved the New York vibes in this book. I also really loved the kind of like creepy, weird atmosphere that this book has. There is a twist almost like right in the beginning. Like I want to say it happens around like 10 chapters in where you're like, oh shit, and it kind of just changes like everything that you think you know about what's happening in the story, which I really did like. And then I do feel like the ending of this book also had a few different twists that I did not see coming. coming. There was definitely a few that I did, but I feel like this ending has so much happening at the end that I feel like there will probably be something about this ending that you don't see coming, so that's very fun. But I had a good time with this one. I think this is another one that I'm giving 3.5 stars because this is another thriller that I would recommend to like get you out of a reading slump. You know, like this is one that you could also read within like 1 or 2 sittings. Right, and then moving on to the 4-star reads, one of the first 4-star reads that I had was The Night Guest, and this is one that I listened to entirely on audio. This book is actually publishing very soon in September, and this one is actually a horror novella, and it's interesting because it's about this woman who like every night she's been having some like sleeping problems and like some insomnia, but every night she realizes from her little like Apple Watch or whatever that she's been walking a lot in her sleep and she doesn't remember it. And like one night she literally has over 40,000 steps that she's walked in the night and she doesn't remember anything about it. Like she doesn't even remember walking or waking up at all. And so this is kind of a very short horror novella about what ends up happening with that. And I don't want to give anything away because not only because the book isn't even out yet, but because it's so short that there's not a lot that happens in this, but I really enjoyed this one. I ended up giving it 4 stars. The only reason why I didn't get the full 5-star from me is because I found the ending to be a little bit underwhelming, or like I wanted just a little bit more out of that ending. But otherwise, oh my god, this was so creepy and it was so weird. I feel like this would be the perfect horror novella to read maybe like at night or in the dark, because I feel like it would only add to the creepy elements of this. I mean, the idea of anything like happening to you while you're asleep, like that's one of the creepiest things in horror for me. I feel like this book did a really great job of like getting to me in that sense, because oh my god, like there were some scenes that really got under my skin with this. But also be warned, there are a lot of really tough animal scenes in this book, like animal abusive scenes, especially with cats, so do be warned about that. Otherwise though, I thought this was great. I still highly recommend it. It was 4 stars for me. I think this one's gonna be a hit when it comes out next month. I also finally got around to reading Bye Baby by Carola Lovering. I mean, in the past, she's published Tell Me Lies, which I personally gave 1 star when I read it so many years ago. Like, I was not a fan. But then she did publish the other book, Too Good to Be True, and I was a pretty big fan of that one. And so I decided to give this one a shot, and I'm surprised I ended up giving this one 4 stars. I ended up really liking this one quite a bit. In this story, we're following these 2 women who are best friends. We're following Billy and then Cassie, and they're both about 35 years old at this point, but they've been best friends ever since they were teenage girls. And Billy and Cassie, you know, at this point in time, they do have very different lifestyles, and I feel like it's starting to put a strain on their friendship and relationship because their lives look so different. Because, you know, Billy is single in New York City and she's traveling a lot and she doesn't really have any interest in having children, whereas Cassie is not only married, but she's just had her first baby, and so her life is kind of focused around her being a mother now. And so there is a little bit of a strain on their friendship because of that. But right at the beginning of this book, in the very first chapter, we read the scene from the future when Billy has taken Cassie's daughter. Like, she kidnaps her baby. And so that's kind of how the book kicks off, and then the main story starts when it says like 50 days before that, and then you kind of see the events leading up to that. You also do get flashback chapters in this book of their teenagehood and like how they became so close in the first place. This is a book that I do hesitate to like recommend this book very widely, because as far as like a mystery thriller goes, I don't think that this book is like super shocking. I don't think that there are any plot twists that I did not see coming. I guess what I'm trying to say is, as far as like the mystery thriller elements go, it didn't really bring anything new to the table and it wasn't that surprising. But I think the reason why I wanted to rate this book as high as I did is because I really connected with these characters, and I personally, I love reading about like toxic female friendships. Like, that's one of my favorite things to read about, just because I find it to be so fascinating. And I feel like Billy and Cassie's relationship just really intrigued me in this, and I just thought their characters were so well written. Another thriller that I ended up giving 4 stars this month is Look in the Mirror by Catherine Steadman. This is one that I was really looking forward to after loving The Family Game by Catherine Steadman. And this one is really fun because we're following this character who's a nanny, and it's kind of like the nanny gone wrong trope, which clearly is a trope that I'm a huge fan of, you know, especially after this month. I've been reading so many books lately that have this like nanny gone wrong trope, but I feel like this book did it in such an interesting way that I've never really seen before. I do really like that in this thriller we're following from the perspective of 2 different women, and so we not only get the perspective from the woman who's going to be the nanny for this really rich family, but then we also do get the perspective from this woman named Nina. And Nina's father has recently passed away, and he left behind this home in the Caribbean Caribbean that she like never knew existed. This book is kind of about how like Nina is starting to discover all of these secrets that her father may have had and about this second life that she like never knew about. And so you're kind of going back and forth between the two perspectives of Nina and this woman who was the nanny. I thought this thriller was so fast paced. I thought it was so interesting and so engaging, and it really went in a direction that I was not anticipating. And I think if you do want to read this book, if that sounds at all interesting to you, then you should jump into reading this book without reading too many reviews, because I feel like some people are being a little bit spoilery with their reviews, with like what they're comparing this to, because I feel like so much of this plot is kept a mystery from you. And for me reading this, it was very interesting to see the direction that this book went into, because it was something that I was not really anticipating, and so I had a lot of fun with that. But for me, it was 4 stars. Like the only reason why I didn't give this one the full 5 stars is because I found the ending to be just a little bit lackluster. Like I just needed something a little bit more from that ending to make it great, but this was still so much fun, and I would highly recommend checking this one out. I think that this was a really entertaining thriller. Also, in the month of August, I was working on some fun video collaboration projects with my friends Gavin and Katie. And so at the start of this month, we all ended up reading Middle of the Night for my channel, but then I also did work on some videos for Gavin and Katie's channels as well. So for Gavin's channel, we ended up reading Someone You Can Build a Nest In, and then for Katie's channel, we ended up reading A Certain Hunger. So the video for A Certain Hunger is not out just yet, so for now I will withhold my thoughts until you can see that video, but I did end up reading A Certain Hunger this month. And then if you missed the video where me, Gavin, and Katie all read Someone You Can Build a Nest In, then I will have that linked down below as well. But this book is not exactly within my comfort zone, you know, because we're talking like a cozy fantasy. I mean, there are some horror elements in this as well as some queer romance that I was definitely into, but you know, I'm not the biggest fantasy reader, and even though this one was kind of more like light cozy fantasy, it was still fantasy, and at times some of the fantasy elements of this definitely went over my head. But for the most part, this was a really enjoyable book. And I think that was mostly due to the fact that there was some really great queer sapphic romance in this book that I was absolutely obsessed with. I mean, we have our main character, Shishishen, and she is a shapeshifter. She's like a monster. And it's about her story about how she's like accidentally falling in love with this human. And this story just had such a unique plot. Like there were so many shocking moments in this book for me. I just loved the way that this author told the story. I loved the way that this book was written. It is chock full of some beautiful quotes. I was actually tabbing this thing left and right with all these beautiful quotes. Dude, the romance in this book, oh my god, it had me screaming. Like they were so cute. There's also some really good like aromantic or asexual rep in this book, which I was really surprised by, to be honest. Like I don't know, there was so much to love about this. I ended up giving this one 4 stars. Like I was very impressed and very surprised. And then hopefully the video for A Certain Hunger will be going up on Katie's channel very soon, and we will complete this trilogy of books that we were able to do for each other's channels. Like how fun. Another book I read this month was The Wedding People, and this is kind of like a contemporary literary fiction style of book where we're following this character named Phoebe, and she arrives at this resort in Rhode Island where there's like a wedding happening at this resort, and everybody at the resort just assumes that she's like part of the wedding or that she's a wedding guest. And it turns out Phoebe is not there for the wedding, but she is there for a very specific reason that I will not spoil for you because it doesn't talk about it in the premise of this, but you find out pretty much like right in the first chapter of this book why she's actually there. The main protagonist, Phoebe, you know, she's kind of going through it in this book because her and her husband have recently separated, and she's just been going through a really hard time in her life. And this book, oh my gosh, this book kind of reminded me of like Frederick Bachman kind of style of writing meets like Rainbow Rowell or something. I don't know how to explain this other than that the character Phoebe, to me, she kind of felt like a character that would have been like written by Rainbow Rowell or something. Like I just really loved the way that her character was written. She was so like relatable and like funny, but like darkly funny at times. And I just really enjoyed the characters in this. Like I thought the characters were so well done. But then it also reminds me of Frederick Bachman in a way. Like this kind of reminds me of something like Anxious People, because I feel like the subject matter of this book is actually really dark and really depressing, but yet the writing itself feels very like lighthearted and almost like silly and kind of fun. And I feel like achieving that kind of tone is so hard as an author. So I really do applaud this author because I feel like she pulled off something that was really incredible here. But I think the story is really about human connection, you know, and I think that that's a really beautiful thing. I will warn you that some of this book is really dark. Like there are some very dark themes happening in this book, but the writing itself never feels that dark. This book, in my opinion, it was just written in such a beautiful way. Like I just immediately connected to the story and these characters. I was tabbing like crazy. Like there were so many parts I wanted to tab, not only for like the beautiful quotes that really stuck with me, but a lot of the things that this character would either think about or say that I just really related related to and connected with right away. There was even kind of a romance thing happening in this book that I was also really invested in that relationship. I don't know, this just impressed me so much. I ended up giving this one 4.5 stars. I really love this. Like, I could see this being one of my top favorites of the year. I could see this being something that I come back to and reread again in the future. That's how much I loved this story and these characters. It just really touched me and it really moved me, and I can see why so many people are saying that this is like their favorite book of the year. I totally get it. Another book that I ended up giving 5 stars once again was actually my reread of It Ends With Us by Colleen Hoover. I know some of you might roll your eyes at me, and that's fine, because I know that it's so basic now to love this book, and everybody wants to like hate on this book, which is also like fine, like everybody's opinions are valid. But I reread this book for the first time in so many years. Like, I haven't read this book in a really long time, and I was worried that like maybe my opinion on it would change after all these years. But honestly, even looking back on it now, like I still love this book just as much as I did back in like 2016. I think the main reason why I do still love this book so much is because how much I love Atlas as a character. Like, I just really love and respect Atlas as a character, and I feel like he has so much heart, you know, like he's such a caring person, and the way that he really looks out for Lily and really protects her throughout her life is just something that I find to be so beautiful and so moving. So yeah, for me this was still 5 stars, but if you would like to see my experience rereading this book and going to see the movie, then I will have that Patreon vlog linked down below if you want to check it out. And then these last 2 books that I gave 5 stars to this month are 2 of my new like all-time favorite books. So one of them is the horror novel Bury Your Gays by Chuck Tingle, and this was such a huge surprise for me. Like, I wasn't expecting to love this book quite as much as I did. In this story, we're following this guy who's a writer. His name is Misha, and he's this gay man, and he gets called into this meeting about the TV show that he's writing, and they basically tell him that they're gonna need him to kill off the gay characters because they no longer want the gay representation on the show. And he's really like torn with this, you know, because he does not want to do this, and he constantly talks about how like we need better queer representation in our movies and our TV shows, and especially stories that don't involve queer tragedies all the time, you know? And so he's really torn on if this is something he even wants to do, like if he even wants to write this for them, but they kind of tell him like, no, like this is not an option, like we're telling you to do this and this is your job. And that is really just the beginning of the story. I don't want to spoil you too much for this plot and where it ends up going and what happens, because this plot is freaking wild. I think if you do plan to read this book, it would definitely be worth checking out the audiobook, because the audiobook is fantastic. Like, not only is it a full cast audiobook, so it's really interesting, but there are some scenes in this audiobook that have sound effects and like extra voices and extra cool things that make the listening experience a real 10 out of 10. And there are just some scenes in this book that are so genuinely creepy that I would like never forget. There's this one scene that takes place on the airplane. Like, oh my god, if you know, you know. Dude, I was so scared. I was listening to that while I was at the gym, and I was getting like goosebumps. Like, I was so freaked out. And it's just been a while, you know, it's been a long time since a horror book has like really creeped me out and gotten under my skin. So I loved that about this. I also loved the asexual representation, because one of the main characters in this book is aromantic and asexual, and there's a lot of talk in this book about the lack of asexual representation in any media ever. And that was something that I just really appreciated as an asexual person myself. Like, thank you. There was really just so much that I loved about this book. Immediately upon finishing this book, I was like, okay, I think it's like a 4.5, because I thought the ending, like, it just lost me a little bit, like the ending of this book. But honestly, like looking back on it, like, no, this feels like a 5 star. Like, this feels like a book that I just want to gush about and like scream from the rooftops, and like that gives me 5-star energy. So I do think that this one is a 5 star for me. And then the last book that I have for this month that was also a 5-star new all-time favorite for me is Slow Dance by Rainbow Rowell. And what a great thing, right? Because Rainbow Rowell is like one of my favorite authors. I mean, Fangirl by Rainbow Rowell is my most reread book of all time. I've read that book 5 times. And so I was really looking forward to Slow Dance, but I was also really nervous because I'm like, oh my god, you know, like Rainbow Rowell hasn't come out with anything in like 10-ish years. So I was kind of like, oh my god, does she still have that same magic? Like, is it still gonna be there? And like, turns out, yes, absolutely. The reason why I was nervous for this one is because this one's actually like a second chance, kind of like friends to lovers romance, which both of those tend to be some of my least favorite romance tropes. Like, I am not a second chance girl at all. And so I was worried because I was like, oh my god, like, is this gonna be my thing? But as it turns out, you know, Rainbow Rowell could literally write any trope, it seems, and I would eat it up. You know, I would just eat that shit up. And in this story, we're following these characters named Shiloh and Carrie, and both of them were really close friends in high school. Everybody always thought that they were gonna get together in high school, and then they never did. And now this main story is taking place 14 years after they were in high school together, and they haven't really talked much at all in the last 14 years. And you know, ever since then, you know, like, he's gone off to the Navy and she's, you know, gotten married and had children. and their lives are just looking very different at this point. But it's interesting because I do love the way that this story is told. Like, it is told kind of back and forth between the present day when they're speaking again for the first time in a long time, but then we also get flashbacks to like see how they were together as teenagers. There was just something about the way that this book was written, okay? Rainbow Rowell just has a way with words. It's like she connects right into my brain and knows how to make me care and knows how to make me relate. In my opinion, I think Shiloh is just like a grown adult version of Kath from Fangirl. Like, she reminds me so much of her in a lot of ways, where like she has the same kind of like insecurities and the same kind of like overthinking about every little thing, anxieties. Like, she just reminds me so much of that character, and I loved that about this. I loved it. I also think her and Carrie, like, they just have such a unique kind of romance, because I love the way that this book talks about like their struggles with intimacy, and like their romance just feels very, very realistic to me in that way. Like, yes, it is a slow burn, you know, because like they've been pining for each other kind of for like 14 years. The way that Rainbow Rowell has written Shiloh in this book, like, she is just so relatable to me. Like, there were so many moments. I literally tabbed like crazy in this book because I couldn't help myself. I genuinely think that there are no other authors out there who write romance the way that Rainbow Rowell does, and I know that maybe it drives some people absolutely crazy. Like, I do see a lot of people saying that they didn't like Shiloh's character in this book because they thought that she was like really annoying or like really frustrating to read, and I'm like, I loved her. Like, I connected with her immediately. So I don't think that this is like the perfect book, but I do think that it's like the perfect book for me. You know, I feel like this is one of those books that feels like it was written just for me, and that feels very special. So I do think, you know, in the past, if you have liked Rainbow Rowell's writing, or maybe if you've never even read a Rainbow Rowell book and you're curious, I would highly, highly recommend reading this one. It's just hard for me to want to recommend this very widely though, because I do think that this is a story where there's not a lot that happens. You know, the plot in this book is not that interesting. It's really just about these two characters and them learning how to get over their struggles with intimacy and like learning how to love each other right. And it's just freaking beautiful. Like, I just connected with these characters so much. I think if you're the kind of person that enjoys a romance that's really focused on the characters, but also like their growth as individuals, as characters, I do think you could like this. This is not anything that's like super groundbreaking, okay? But I loved it. I loved it. 5 stars. Oh my god. I can't wait to reread this one in the future, because you know I will. I'll be coming back to this. All right, so those are all of the books that I read in the month of August. I don't know, August was a really weird reading month for me, you know, because I did have so much success, because I did have a handful of things that I really enjoyed reading this month, and like the majority of the books that I read this month were rated 4 stars or higher. But I think because I ended up having so many DNFs this month, and it was such a struggle to get through the ones that I really didn't like, that it feels like August was not that great, because I feel like I put myself into a reading slump. And so I don't know, I'm ready to put August behind me. Honestly, like, I'm ready to put this entire summer behind me. I am ready to move on to September. That's why this wrap up is going up a little bit early, because like August, I'm over it. I'm ready for my September reads. I have such a big September TBR. I will be posting, hopefully the next video that you see from me is going to be like my September TBR video, because there's so many exciting things that I'm going to be working on in the month of September that I can't wait. But anyways, let me know how the month of August went for you. Reading wise, did you read any new favorites? How many books did you read in August? Also, let me know if you've read any of the books that I just talked about in this video. Let me know what your thoughts are on them. Thank you so much for watching as always, and I'll see you very soon with another video. Bye!